My name's Mike Gilbert, and I studied politics, philosophy and economics back in the 1980s. The span of the period we covered back then was from the Enlightenment right the way through to the mid-20th century. And I have to say, a very fascinating period it is as well. More recently, I've become quite disillusioned with mainstream politics, largely because it doesn't seem to be addressing the myriad of problems that both the country and the planet seems to be facing, and we've got politicians running around spouting what's basically a lot of nonsense, while the situation that we want to try and address seems to be getting worse and worse. A number of thinkers, academics and religions offer solutions to these problems. I've got a selection of books here. There's a book called Utopia for realists. There's the Russell Brand's book Revolution. There's the Quran, and there's the Christian Bible. All of these books and some of the others offer both an analysis and some kind of suggestions as to how we might improve things in the future. The problem for me, however, is that unless you've got some kind of undergirding economic understanding of why we are where we are now, then it's very difficult to imagine how we're going to put forward any kind of meaningful solution. There's lots of talk about people being done to by politicians at the top, but if you do things to people, they generally reject it. So if you want to sort of deal with things like artificial intelligence, climate change, the crisis of polluting the planet, then you have to take people with you. And there's a mechanism that needs to be put in place to enable that to happen. That mechanism we call Blue Revolution. And I'll explain the genesis of Blue Revolution using what I've described as 6, maybe 7 pyramids. So there are 2 words that I think we need to understand if we're going to understand the progress of politics over the last 1,000 years. And those 2 words are consciousness and contradiction. Because revolutions occur when you have consciousness becoming aware of social and economic contradictions. We've basically had 2 revolutions, and the 2 revolutions that we've had occurred here, and they occurred here, and we're now at the point where we're experiencing a shift in our consciousness here because we're picking up some contradictions around the way society is being organised.
So what are these 2 revolutions?
Right, I'll go on and explain those. You'll notice 2 things before I do progress to talk about the revolutions and the social order that was changed as a result of those revolutions. I'll say 2 things. You'll notice that this pyramid here is pretty flat, and that pyramid there is pretty flat. Okay, but just bear in mind the concept of contradiction and consciousness. Consciousness being how we, as individuals, feel that we fit into the world. We have an understanding of ourselves as conscious creatures, as conscious beings, and that consciousness, if you like, is shaped by the environment in which we find ourselves. So the first iteration of society, when we fell out the trees, became known as tribal society. Tribal society is characterised by sort of 1 or 2 fairly straightforward characteristics. Tribal society, as I've said, is flat. It's also differentiated very heavily along lines of sex, men and women. There's no other really important differentiating characteristics. If you're from a different tribe, you may have different kind of characteristics from other tribes, but within your own tribe, the only real distinction is that whether you're a male or a female. If you're a male, you've got certain roles within that tribe. If you're females, you've got other roles. It tends to be accented very heavily towards men. The councils of tribal societies tends to be men, but women also had quite high status. And the reason that women had high status in tribal society is that if you wanted to prove the origins of a child, if you wanted to prove the child's father, paternity, then you really couldn't. It was, as the Romans said, a matter of opinion as to who the father of the child was. But with a mother, it was a matter of fact. So women had very high status. The problem with this period in history was it was pretty brutal. That resources were short. Tribes had very little control over how they managed to create their wealth, their surplus value. They tended to live hand to mouth. Surplus value might be someone dragging back an extra antelope, but having dragged back the extra antelope, everybody would have to share it out because, of course, you couldn't store wealth in that form. It would just rot. So essentially, it was a fairly unsophisticated society. So, very simple, very little value. What happened subsequent to this period in history is that we began to create surplus. Surplus value began to become created. In other words, we managed to sort of marshal our environment, marshal our physical environment, and create wealth, or essentially what would become wealth. So all the strict organisation of the tribe became challenged by the contradiction that we were actually making more than we needed. Now you imagine that in a society like this, very rigid society, there's absolutely nothing to give away, there's nothing to give out, everything that you've got you consume, there's nothing to store. And then suddenly humanity becomes capable, because we're clever people, we're a clever species, you know, we've got the ability to communicate, we've got the ability to think, we start to create some surplus. What then happens as a result of that is that certain individuals within the tribe begin to get prominence, they become prominent. And as a result of that prominence, another kind of social order occurs, and this is the first of our revolutions. So the first revolution is the revolution from this kind of simple society to a more complicated society, which looks a little bit more like this. And this is our autocratic or our feudal society. And society becomes a lot more sophisticated. It becomes hierarchical, so whoever it is who's managed to gain the top position here passes their wealth down their male line. So this is the birth of patriarchy. In the tribal society, there was no patriarchy, and the reason there was no patriarchy was that there was nothing to be patriarchal about. Patriarchy only happens when you want to control women, to control resources. If you haven't got any resources, you don't actually need to control women. And that's how patriarchy works. And patriarchy is run from this period in humanity's evolution right the way through, you could argue, to the present day. So this society is very, very hierarchical. Hanging off the bottom of this society, you've got the people. You've got the people who are creating the wealth that goes up to the people who are operating at the top of society. Now, again, thinking about your card, thinking about the parameters of feudal society, we've tossed aside our tribal society. We've now got ourselves into a situation where there's very little in the way of equality. I mean, okay, there wasn't a huge amount of inequality in our tribe. We all ate the same amount of whatever was brought home by the hunters, and we all brought our children up in absolutely the same way, so there was no real inequality. But here, we're starting to see inequality creeping in, because what we're seeing here is the people here have a very different experience of life to the people down here, the people at the bottom. And we have this very thin band down here, which, and this band, essentially, I'll come on to it, essentially represents the next collection of revolutionary individuals who take us on to the next revolution. But before we move on to that stage, let's have a think about where we are with this one. So just imagine, could you say there is one collective consciousness for everybody in this situation? In the tribal situation, you could say pretty much everybody would have thought the same way. There'd be very little differentiation in what people thought, how people experienced emotions like fear. They experience emotions like fear in very much the same way. In this model, you've got different tiers within society. And do you think there's a collective consciousness that applies to all of those individuals at every single tier on that triangle there? No, absolutely. So what happens is you require power, and you require coercion, and you require force, because you haven't got a collective understanding of this is an ideal world, this is fantastic, you know, look at this, look, here I am down here toiling away in the fields, and there's the overlord or the lord or the king up there, you know, and they've got all the wealth that I'm creating down here. I might be a slave, or I might be somebody who's a free individual, but nonetheless I'm still working to somebody who's further up this particular hierarchy to me. Other things become more sophisticated as a result of the evolution into this model. Wealth, as I've said, is concentrated here, but it's created down here, as it always is. It's always created at this end of society, and it always ends at that end. Religion, you had the move away from polytheism, the idea of worshipping numerous gods, to the religion of worshipping one God. So our Quran and our Holy Bible start to gain some kind of relevance here. The reason for that, of course, is if you're the person sitting in here, what you want is to know that the one God that sits above you says you are the person who should be sitting there. Okay, it's divinely ordained by the monotheistic God. Okay, so there's a big change there. And in politics, of course, there is public politics. The politics flows down from the top. So the king decides what these people are doing and what these people at this level are doing and what people down here are doing. And the king enforces all that. I mean, the king may not enforce very much down here because he'd get people at this level to do that. But nonetheless, you can see how the whole thing flows. And the religion reinforces the whole thing. So you might not have a collective consciousness, if you like, but you know what's going to get you hung, drawn and quartered, or is going to get you executed because you've done something to compromise the power, the status, or the authority of the person sitting here. Now, whereas with the end of tribal society, it occurred over a very, very extended period of about 4,000 or 5,000 years, the demise of this system happened relatively quickly. So from about the 12th or the 13th century, various things occurred, various historical events occurred, the plague occurred, and things like that had the effect of driving up wages and causing certain individuals to be shaken out of this system, and they become free of the strictures of this hierarchy. They're freemen effectively, and they can make business, make money in their own way. And what a lot of these people at the base here tended to do was go into trade. So they travelled abroad, they would make money elsewhere, and they would come back. They would have wealth. The problem was, of course, that all the power came down from the top, and the wealth was expected to go up from the bottom, as it always had done in this particular model, this autocratic or feudal model. Over time, and by the time we get into the sort of the 17th century, the people down here are getting larger in number, and they're getting pretty tired of being told what to do by the people up here and passing all their wealth from here up to the top, when they can see that the person here is engaging in wars with cousins, settling old scores with noblemen on the continent, or just having their hair permed. They became people who had vanity projects that the people down here were beginning to pay for. Now, religion was a prime mover in helping to shift to our next revolution, because under this system, Catholicism was the ideal religion for something like this, because again, Catholicism reinforced the idea that there was a divine right to be at the top of the pyramid, but because Catholicism itself had the Pope at the top of its own religious pyramid, and it mutually reinforced itself. What happened to encourage a shift in thinking was that we had something called the Reformation. And the Reformation was a really important step in humanity's religious evolution. Religion went into crisis for hundreds of years because people called Protestants came along and actually reinterpreted the Bible and said, no, this isn't about the church reinforcing the needs of the people here. The people here shouldn't rely on a Catholic church to keep them where they are. Actually, it's the people down here and what they do and how they live their lives and conduct themselves that actually determines, how much wealth is being created and where power should go. So they were they were reformists. The Reformation wanted to sort of change the nature of this structure, and sort of change the hierarchical nature of the structure and see less of the money going to the top, more of the money staying down here, and doing good works on behalf of a God that looked after the base rather than looked after people in the top of the hierarchy. Eventually, this came to in Britain. This came to a head with the English Civil War, where the Roundheads represented the sort of Protestants, and the Catholics were represented by the Crown. We know how that ended. That ended with the beheading of Charles I. It was a symbolic act of saying no to one old system and bringing in a new system, a new, essentially, capitalist system in its earliest iterations. So this is the point at which we have our second revolution. We have our second revolution here. We have it between the 16th and the 17th century. There's a few bits of upheaval on the way. Charles I was beheaded. Cromwell took over Parliament, which is essentially the same Parliament that we've got now. But his son Charles II was put on the throne in what's called the Restoration. Charles came to the throne. Charles II came to the throne in the Restoration. But Charles II's son, was unfortunately a man called James II who had converted back to Catholicism. And so that caused a major constitutional crisis. We don't want another Catholic on the throne. And eventually what they did is they put James II's daughter on the throne with her husband, and that was the reign of William and Mary. That's all right. We've gone straight through. Okay, so that's the point at which we have our next revolution. So that's the revolution that takes us from feudalism into capitalism. Okay, and capitalism is a very interesting development in its own right, and it's essentially the last revolution that humanity's ever had. We've not really had what you could call a compelling revolution since the revolution took us from feudalism into capitalism. What's happening? You might say, well, China and Russia, they're socialist countries. Essentially, capitalism is a system of creating surplus value. In other words, creating a profit, and it really doesn't matter whether the person who creates the profit, well, it doesn't matter who controls the profit, whether it's the state or it's a capitalist. It's the worker creating it, and the profit flows up to the top. Okay, so what you've got essentially is in the West you had a breakdown. You broke the system down, the one big triangular hierarchy, and we broke it down into different sort of sections. So we have religion as a small microcosm of what's called the bourgeois state, the capitalist state. We have the state itself, the organisation of government. Nice little triangle there, hierarchical in character. We've got the law reinforcing the religion, and the state reinforcing the law. And then as a 20th century iteration, we've got the BBC. So the BBC comes along as another kind of element of this sort of bourgeois state, if you like. This idea we've got these smaller hierarchies, smaller pyramids, but essentially they're reinforcing capitalism.
Mike,
Yeah.
pushing the point a bit too far, isn't it? Can you put the BBC on the level with your other two?
Well, the BBC has many of the characteristics that the earliest iterations of the capitalist state has. So, for example, the characteristics that we associate with this period in history here, the autocratic feudal society, are that it's unfair, it's elitist, it's based on status. Okay, you've got your place in the pecking order, and you can't move from there. You know, there's very little sort of mobility within this system. If you happen to be down here, then you pretty much stay down there. If you happen to be at the top, you can make some, you make no kind of progress. You stay where you are, and the power flows down from the top. Or what capitalism did was capitalism took those elements of the autocratic elements of the feudal system, and it fused them with three new concepts. So it's a good point you make. I'm glad you've reminded me that I need to go on to this. And the three new principles that were created in this bourgeois capitalist system were principles of contract, choice, and consent. So the guys at the bottom of the old feudal system were demanding the right to make money in their own way, to hang on to their own money, not to give it to the state, not to give it to the king, not to finance wars that they weren't interested in, not to pay for sort of new wigs and peacocks and palaces. No, they wanted to spend the money doing good works on behalf of the communities they served. They were the Puritans. They wanted a Puritan, simple life that enabled them to make money and do good works with it. So you had an unfortunate conflation, if you like, of the negative side of feudalism, the elitism, the unfairness, and the obsession with status, combined with the principles that came with capitalism, principles of contract, choice, and consent. Okay, but the contract, choice, and consent really only worked for the benefit of the people at the top of these hierarchies here. The lawyers could contract, choose, and consent, but if you were down here somewhere, you had very little opportunity to do those things. So although in principle you'd broken away from the constrictions of the feudal system, the reality for most ordinary working people was they couldn't really enjoy any of those principles. They weren't available to them. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the status, they didn't have the wherewithal. So you've got a funny kind of fusion. The earliest iterations of the bourgeois capitalist state were heavily influenced by the feudal system and the feudal structures that capitalism inherited. And if you look today at our sort of post proper capitalist system, and I'll come on to explain a bit more about what that means. If you look at our system now, you can see the relics of the feudal system even in the way we do politics today. The state opening of Parliament, the Queen's speech, the House of Lords. You've got some throwbacks to the earliest iterations of our capitalist system, which were, for one reason or another, preserved by the growth in this sort of in this bourgeois state. Okay. So I said we've had two revolutions. The first revolution was from tribalism to feudalism. The second revolution was from feudalism to capitalism. I've explained why, I hope I've explained why the Russian Revolution really wasn't a revolution that was any different from what happened in Britain. It might have been a different kind of revolution, but it was essentially the same thing. It was a revolution that wanted to create capital by exploiting the labour power of the working classes. If you were a worker in Russia, you were expected to work for the state. If you were a worker in the West, you were expected to work for the capitalist. The reality on the ground for the worker was exactly the same process. You're working to create wealth for somebody else, be it the state or be it the capitalist. So although you can say, well, they were two very different revolutions, essentially they weren't. They appeared within about 200 or so years of each other, and they essentially achieved the same thing. Somebody was taking wealth from the efforts of working people and spending it.
Those that have and those that haven't. You know?
Sorry?
You have a split society.
Yeah. You had a split society. But I guess because capitalism is based on contract, choice, and consent, you can't have a system like that without having contract, choice, and consent. Even in Russia, it's managed to sort of form itself into a kind of Western society. Because although the Russian Revolution was called communist, essentially it was the Industrial Revolution. Stalin wanted to industrialize Russia and just pushed ahead to do it. And I use this example. We had the enclosures, and we forced people off the land into the factories. Stalin told the peasants, "You're going to go into the factories," and if they didn't, he shot them. And so, essentially, the same thing was going on, getting people off the land because and industrializing production of food because you needed to feed this massive population of industrial workers. Okay, so that's where that's probably at peak capitalism around about 1900. That's pretty much what society in Britain and in various iterations of it around the Western world. A religion that's separate from the state, a state that's separate from the law, and you've got this BBC sort of acting to sort of promote the interests of those three there, kind of propaganda wing for the capitalist bourgeois state. Okay? All well and good. We all like that. It all feels okay. We managed to sort of fight 2 world wars with that model. Why should anything have to change? What's the point in changing it? It seems to work. And that's the mindset I think the vast majority of people have got now. The vast majority of people think, somehow this has worked for the last sort of 150, 200 years. It's not a system that's broke. We should be able to do something politically to make this system work like it used to work in the past. A blue revolution, we say, that is impossible to do. It's not going to happen. And we are at a point now where we need to have our third revolution. Okay? Now, revolutions, as I've said, come about because of two things. They come about because of contradictions, and they come about because people are conscious of those contradictions. Okay? So all the revolutions that have taken place, the two that have taken place so far, have occurred because of that. People, the bourgeoisie in the 17th century, suddenly thinking, do you know what, I'm not paying for that king and all his silly, phony wars and his pampering and his palaces and his peacocks. And so we're at the point now where the people again are beginning to stir. What's going on? Why are people so angry? Why are people so frustrated with politics? Why is everyone sitting in front of their television saying, do you know what, I can't stand that Boris Johnson, or I can't stand that Jeremy Corbyn. Something's got to be done. But nobody knows what to do. In fact, Russell Brand, I think in this book here, his book Revolution, actually, and he obviously hobnobs with the Globe's elite, particularly the Globe's elite celebrities and people like that. He says, when he meets people like Prince Andrew and he meets sort of film directors, he meets the American political elite, they don't know what to do either. It's like we've started this anarchy of the free market. It's like a train rumbling along some tracks. Nobody actually knows how to sort of stop this train or take this train and put it on some tracks that aren't going to eventually drop off the side of a cliff. And so, as a result of my study of the Enlightenment and politics up to the 20th century, I had a look at some of these ideas and tried to sort of formulate some means by which we could safely move into the next phase of humanity's political and economic and social evolution, and that's called Blue Revolution. What are we going to take? I've said we're going to take contract choice consent from here, from the bourgeois revolution, and we're going to lose the bits of the feudal system that we continue to deal with today. So what does that mean in practical political terms? Well, it means a number of things, really. It means abolition of the House of Lords. House of Lords is a throwback, the fag end of the feudal system. Do we need it? No, of course we don't need it. You know, why do we need a House of Lords? Why do we need to represent a system like this in the 21st century? What about politics? How does it reflect in politics? Well, politics is still a bit like this system. It's still a top-down system. It's still elitist. You've only got to look at Parliament, 650 MPs representing 65 million people. That's pretty elitist. They're pretty important people, those 650 MPs, but how are they chosen? They're chosen by political parties. They're not chosen by the people in reality. They're chosen by a political party that says, we want you to stand for us, and you'll get elected because you're standing in Mansfield South, or you're standing in Boston and Skegness. The reality is that there's very little democracy in this system because political parties still play a very important role in determining who does or who doesn't get into Parliament. But of course, the other thing is when you've got political parties, you've got something called interest groups who can access political parties. They can go and talk to chairmen of political parties. They can talk to MPs in groups. They can get MPs to join groups, and they can influence decision making. And is that decision making beneficial to ordinary working people? Well, it's arguable that it's probably not really beneficial to us. It's beneficial to a whole collection of people who bear very little resemblance to ourselves. So there's a couple of things there. You could start, if you wanted to sort of gradually introduce these changes, you could start within mainstream politics by banning the whipping system. I mean, the whipping system is a means by which a political party will bully an MP into voting in a particular way because it's in that political party's interests for that MP to vote in that particular way. But whipping might actually be intended to benefit somebody else, some sponsor of that political party. So we can't really trust, as ordinary people, that we're getting a fair deal with any of this. We may very well be getting led up the garden path. But nothing is going to change until we actually make a change in the nature of the political system, because the political system is the problem. You can replace, you can have a new party that suddenly comes to prominence and replaces Labour and the Conservative Party, but if it exists in this model, if it exists in this system, it will become just as contaminated as the Labour and the Conservative parties have become contaminated, because it's the system that's the problem. The system, just like feudalism, needs to be cast aside by the early bourgeoisie. This system that we're now needs to be cast aside by the ordinary workers of Britain. And the way we're going to do that, as I've said, is to do things like promote the idea that we need to abolish the House of Lords and then access far, far more people into the democratic process. So the way it would work as far as one model that I've got is concerned, I mean, you said you wanted answers. I can give you an answer that I've got. That if I said to you, well, I'm going to be the one who gets my answer actually accepted by Blue Revolution, that would be completely counterproductive, and it would be against the interest of Blue Revolution, because Blue Revolution is about the people deciding what happens, not about someone like me coming along and saying, well, this is my model, and it's the only model that works. I mean, Chris and I have differences of opinion. Whether you want to spend money on police officers or you want to spend it on nuclear weapons is not really a matter for Blue Revolution. It's a matter for the political system to resolve that by actually having a debate amongst the general public and getting some sort of consensus about what the public want to pay for.
Surely proportional representation is a very, very small step.
Yeah, it's a very small step, but proportional representation is problematic for me, because proportional representation basically puts a confusing hodgepodge of political parties, who, and I've said political parties don't really operate in a particularly democratic way, into a system which actually sort of works to the advantage of political and economic elites. So you're not going to have any sort of radical change in politics. The world's not going to suddenly start being fairer, more equitable, and better for working people by simply adopting proportional representation.
It's the first step.
It may be
When you get to this,
it may be a first step.
Ideal stay where you are. You have to take very tiny
Well,
steps.
you see, I think from my perspective, it's really difficult, isn't it? I mean, we put this today. We put this out on Facebook. We put this out on Endeavour FM. We've advertised it in pamphlets. We've spoken to people, and we've got we've got marvellous collection of people here. I'm not saying they haven't, but we haven't exactly got a huge number of people. People are disengaged from the political system, and the reason I think they're disengaged from the political system is they don't have any power in the political system. Your power is to go and vote.
But don't have faith in it.
No faith in it. No, it hasn't got. There's no faith in it, and the reason there's no faith in it is your contribution to the political system is to every 5 years, or possibly every 5 years, when you're told to go along and vote. But how you vote doesn't really determine what happens in Parliament or what happens in politics. It's almost an irrelevant act.
So the lack of faith that you talk about happened before the capitalist revolution. The very fact that people's got a lack of faith in the system
Yeah.
is the sign that
Yeah.
you're probably getting near to
That's
the end.
that. Well, that's the
to the end
conscious.
of that triangle.
Yes, that's the consciousness versus contradictions. We're now seeing contradictions in our own system. The contradictions we're seeing are, as ordinary working people, we haven't got any political power, and we really ought to have more political power. And the other contradiction we've got now is that actually we're paying for the system with our tax, and moreover, and more worryingly, and more outrageously, we're paying for the system with our debt. So we have a government that wants to just indebt the nation, indebt us, to pursue the government's own political goals, with no recognition that in the long term, that debt that they're driving up, has to be paid for by the efforts of ordinary working people. And ordinary working people don't necessarily have to pay that debt off. What they have to do is suffer the consequences of not having services available to them because the state can no longer afford to pay for them. So at some point, if we have a big spending spree by a government, it may very well be that we end up having problems within the National Health Service, or we end up having tax ratcheted up to pay for the debt that they've incurred. We've got big challenges ahead of us with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is going to take away from us the kind of jobs that many of us are doing. What are we going to do about artificial intelligence? Artificial intelligence is a threat to ordinary working people, and it needs to have some kind of response that involves ordinary working people. But at the moment, what you'll have politicians in Westminster deciding what the implications of AI are going to be on you and me. And it may be something like a $5,000 a year living wage or something like that. And we're just basically cast off to live a life of idle pointlessness. Who knows?
What do you think is one of the major causes of complaint that the average guy in the street against the capitalist system we're working on at the moment?
Well, it's not a capitalist system. I mean, if it were a capitalist system, it would have some kind of, it would have some sort of integrity, and it would have some sort of morality. I mean, the point about a capitalist system is that to be capitalist, you need to create capital. And capital is very clearly defined as the proceeds of exploited labour power. So I'm a capitalist, okay, and you're a worker. I make you work 16 hours a day, and you make a product for me, which I then sell for £100, and I give you £10 of that £100. I've got £90 worth of capital, and you've got £10 worth of wage. That's capitalism. Now, the problem with that system is, to call it capitalism, it's capital that's got to be flowing around the system. In other words, it's the proceeds of exploited labour power that needs to be passed about. What we've got today is a free market, and capitalism's largely come to an end, and what we've done is to try and reboot our capitalist system. We've started to pump debt into the system, a bit like passing air through a model steam train. You make it work, it looks like it's working, but it's not actually working at all.
Okay, let's give another scenario. I'm the managing director of a global company.
Yep.
That company loses £20 million a year.
Yeah.
I get a bonus of 20 million because of that failure. How do we change that?
Well, I mean, I think everybody in the Western world knows, ordinary working people know that there is something rancid about the way the economy is working today. I mean, you don't have to go very far to identify what some of the causes might be. So for argument's sake, a very good example would be, we improved socialism improved the lot of the working class in Boston, in Britain, after the Second World War. We've got a national health service, we've got decent housing, we've got a decent education system. So lots of good stuff happened after the Second World War. The trouble is, there was a little bit of overreach in terms of what the state got itself involved with. And as a result, the state drove businesses away from the United Kingdom. Businesses went elsewhere. They found that it was much easier to exploit workers in Vietnam and China than it is to exploit workers in Britain. So consequently, they make a load of stuff out in China. That results in a net loss of work in Britain, of course, and everybody can see it's not a system that's in any way sustainable. But it happens because the pressures of global economics allow it to happen. So it's very to answer your question, it's very difficult to do something like that. What you've got to have, though, in my opinion, and again, this is about Blue Revolution, about what the beneficial outcomes of a revolution like this could be, is that ordinary working people need to be empowered politically. So ordinary working people can start demanding that some of the activities that these bankers and these businesses get up to, and it's not just in this country, it's all over the world. People are exploiting working people. And we should be very frightened about that, because at the end of the day, we haven't got any power. Nobody in this room has got any power. What we do is we trust that our politicians will do a decent job of running our nation on our behalf. And actually, you can go into places like the Ukraine, and you can see politicians absolutely exploiting, far, far worse than anything that happens here, their population to line their own pockets, putting their money into offshore accounts, making sure that they're okay. They're essentially these people like that, these global oligarchs, if you like. They're a bit like feudal systems, aren't they? They operate like a feudal system. It's their entitlement to rip off their country and to take the money that their country should have to spend on health and education and stick it in an offshore bank account and dip into it when they want to. It's a global problem and it needs a global solution. But the point is, it needs a global solution that comes from the bottom of society, because it's not going to happen
I've got an
from the
opinion
top.
I've got an opinion that's an answer to that, and it's something that I think I saw on a French blog. It was the only real change is when the GDP is no longer the measure of national success. And you're never going to get the political elite to vote for that, because it's like getting a turkey to vote for Christmas. It's not going to happen. The best chance we've got is that the next generation coming through the system, like the Thornbergs of the age, are that they see that the environment and our mental well-being is more important than money. And that's most likely to be the next system after GDP. But how we get there is a massive step. I think the beginning would be to empower the people at the bottom, which is what this is about, I think.
I mean, it's about empowering the people. You're not going to get these changes from the top. No one's going to come along and say, do you know what, I'm going to kind of close down all these offshore bank accounts because it doesn't work in my interest to do that. But if the people here, and not only the people here, I mean, I mentioned contract choice and consent because the vast majority of Western people, who in this room thinks that contract choice and consent are three bad principles? No,
they're not.
They're not.
You're fighting against a human nature. Human nature will always look to increase your individual or your tribe.
That's why communism failed, isn't it? Communism failed for that very reason.
But no matter what title you give it, there's always somebody who wants to be at the top of the tree.
You say that though, but if you have a political system which has contract choice consent absolutely built in at its core, then actually it's a very safe system, because you can't really overreach or overstretch or do something to harm somebody else, because they have to consent to that. So essentially, the Western working class, and I include all of us in that, the Western working people are politically the most mature we've ever been, because we can see that actually what you're describing is wrong, that somebody wants to put themselves ahead of everybody else. It's okay to sort of be different from everybody else. It's okay economically to have a bit more than everybody else. No one says that we've all got to earn the same amount of money. It's okay to earn money in your own way, as long as you pay your taxes in a responsible way. But what is happening is that on a global scale isn't occurring.
I suppose one thing about your shapes is they're all triangles. So there's always going to be somewhere at the top. And there's always going to be, and I don't think through
you can't get away from it.
But the idea is to make the triangle as flat as possible.
I used to always have and it's a little bit simplistic, but through my life, and I'm at 60 years old now, is those that lead, those that follow, and those that haven't got a clue. And that's what I've seen. Now, whether that's just a cynical view,
well, if you
but then I come from Northern Ireland and I've seen what politics and religion
Yeah.
into people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But at the end of it, our base instincts are still the same.
Well, you see, the problem is that you take some. I think it was you that mentioned, religion. You've got the Quran and you've got the Christian Bible. I mean, people would argue, and they do argue, that secularism will not deliver. Secularism won't deliver the kind of morality you're talking about, and you have to turn to a book like the Quran, or you have to turn to a book like the Bible to get that kind of morality. My argument is that's nonsense. Those books have had their day. Yeah. Those books were written to kind of promote the interests of an earlier phase in history.
Any religion is developed by a human being.
Yes,
but for their power base.
But for a particular political and economic purpose. Yes. And that particular political and economic purpose has gone. We've got a new particular political and economic purpose now. We've got the free market giving us effectively contract choice and consent on a mass scale. The problem with it is it's being gamed by certain individuals to advance their own interests, and the only way you'll prevent them doing that isn't to return to the Quran or to the Bible. It will be to embed in your political system the concepts of contract choice and consent, and cast off all the rubbish that came from previous social and economic iterations. I mean, the point that was made about GDP is absolutely spot on. But GDP, if you cut down GDP, you cut down the amount of wealth that's available to people. So it has an impact on us, yeah? Cut down GDP, we have less money, because GDP is how much money the nation has got. The only people who can genuinely consent to a cut in the GDP is us. And to get that agreed, we have to have a political system that empowers us and doesn't just give us a vote every 5 years so we can vote in the same collection of people into the same corrupted sort of system. Yeah, and that's the challenge of the Blue Revolution. But I would say this, and given that I've illustrated we've had two previous revolutions, there is a revolution on the way. I mean, you can see the contradictions, and you can see the consciousness of the people recognising something isn't working. Now, the challenge is, which way does that revolution go? Okay, because the revolution could push forward in the way that I'm describing, and the people are empowered, and we start to take control of our nation, and we start to introduce the changes that we need to introduce to save the planet, climate crisis, artificial intelligence, the problem of pollution and overconsumption. We can do that ourselves because we're empowered, or we can sit around and wait for people in a system like this to tell us you can't have more than one kid, you can only eat meat on a Monday, you can't fly in an aeroplane, you can't do this, you can't do that. And we'll sit there thinking, why should we listen to what you're telling us to do?
Yeah, the people who eat the most meat and fly the most aeroplanes.
Exactly. Well, you see it with these Hollywood stars, don't you? And with these politicians, they tell us what we're supposed to do, but they're not prepared to do it for themselves. They want to carry on living a high life. So to conclude things then, and I know I've probably bored everybody to death, but to conclude then, what we do need to do is start thinking about how our consciousness has been shaped by our current economic situation, our frustration, the fact we're paying a lot of debt to keep a system going which is basically out of date, and think about how we're going to progress things into the future. There is a model for it. It's a Blue Revolution sort of model. It's about bringing politics from the base into the politics at the top. You empower local councils, or you empower local councillors to play a part in making national decisions. So it isn't the case that Matt Warman goes away and puts his hand up, one of 650. We have something like 63,000 people contributing to the decisions that are being made, bringing it right down to something like one representative for every, 2,000 people. So there's a real sense that you're being represented by somebody, and if you don't like the person who's representing you, you can cast them out when you have the next election. So that's it. I've kind of finished what I'm saying, and I'm happy for you to fire any questions at me. If you find any contradictions in what I've said, please explore them with me. I'm more than happy to hear them. And before you go, take a copy of the pamphlet, The History of Politics Simplified.